What does it mean to be born into power but never truly own it? To wear the crown of a kingdom, yet constantly battle whispers of betrayal, lust, and political intrigue? The story of Queen Isabella II of Spain is not just a chapter in European history. It is a storm of passion, scandal, and downfall that shook an entire empire in the 19th century. We must travel back to Madrid, the heart of Spain, in the early 1830s. A city draped in tradition, where the ringing of church bells blended with the clattering of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone streets. Spain, once a mighty empire stretching across oceans, was now weakened, divided, and searching for its identity. It was in this fragile time that a young girl, barely 3 years old, inherited the throne, ushering in one of the most controversial reigns in Spanish history. Isabella II was not like the majestic queens of legend. She was fragile, impulsive, and surrounded by enemies from the very beginning. Her accession to the throne sparked civil war between supporters of her claim and those of her uncle, Don Carlos, in what became known as the Carlist Wars. From her earliest days, her crown rested not on her head but on the swords of generals and the cunning of politicians who used her as a pawn. But it was not just politics that defined Isabella. It was her personal life, her affairs, her lovers, and her constant defiance of convention that made her the most scandalous queen of the 19th century. While other monarchs carefully crafted images of dignity, Isabella became infamous for the chaos of her private passions, which spilled into public view. She was crowned in a world where a queen was expected to be the model of virtue, the symbol of purity. Yet Isabella shattered those illusions with every decision she made, whether in love, in marriage, or in power. Her reign would be marked not only by war and instability, but also by whispers in palace corridors, rumors in taverns, and satire in newspapers across Europe. This is the tale of Isabella II, a queen caught between duty and desire, between a throne she never fully controlled and a personal life she could not restrain. Her story is not only about the fall of a monarch, but about the fragility of power itself. But who exactly was Isabella II, and what forces shaped the queen who would scandalize Europe? To understand Isabella II, we must step into the world that surrounded her, a Spain torn apart by civil war, political rivalry, and endless backroom deals. Unlike queens who carved their destinies with iron will, Isabella's fate was molded by the hands of men who circled her like vultures, each seeking to control the crown through her youth and inexperience. When her father, King Ferdinand VII, died in 1833, Isabella was only 3 years old. Too young to rule, her mother, Queen Regent Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, assumed power on her behalf. Maria Cristina was a complicated figure, intelligent, ambitious, but also pragmatic to the point of coldness. She needed Isabella's throne secure, but her regency was immediately challenged by Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos, who refused to accept a female successor. Thus erupted the First Carlist War, a brutal conflict that split Spain into two visions: the Carlists, who fought for absolutism and traditional monarchy under Don Carlos, and the Isabelinos, who supported constitutional monarchy under Isabella. The young queen, barely aware of her crown, became the banner of one faction in a bitter, bloody struggle that would scar Spain for decades. But war was not the only force shaping her childhood. Behind palace doors, intrigue brewed. Generals like Baldomero Espartero and Ramon Maria Narvaez would rise as kingmakers, using Isabella's reign as a battlefield for their own ambitions. They were not loyal to her as a person, they were loyal to the idea of power. To them, Isabella was a symbol, a pawn, and at times a burden. As she grew, Isabella was surrounded by rituals of royalty, grand processions, endless etiquette, and the suffocating weight of expectation. Yet outside the palace walls, Spain was restless. The streets of Madrid echoed with political debates, with taverns buzzing about whether a teenage queen could ever command respect. Newspapers mocked her appearance, her voice, even her mannerisms. Satirical cartoons painted her as a puppet of her ministers or as a frivolous young woman more concerned with pleasure than statecraft. And there was another layer, the personal. Isabella's arranged marriage to her cousin, Francisco de Assis de Bourbon, was less a union of love than of political convenience. Francisco was delicate, soft-spoken, and often mocked for his effeminacy. He did not match the image of a strong royal consort. Their marriage, cold and passionless, left Isabella searching for affection elsewhere, opening the door to the many affairs that would define her legacy. Still, despite the scandals to come, there was a strange charm to her youth. Descriptions of Isabella in her early reign mention her round face, bright eyes, and youthful beauty, which captivated courtiers at first sight. But beauty alone could not stabilize a kingdom on fire, nor silence the whispering voices eager to tear her down. She stood at the center of a storm, generals pulling her in one direction, politicians in another, and her own heart pulling her elsewhere still. In this crucible of power, Isabella began to carve her identity, not as the saintly queen her supporters hoped for, but as the scandalous monarch Europe would never forget. But when Isabella came of age, and the crown no longer belonged to her mother or her ministers, how would she wield it? When Isabella II officially took the throne in her teens, Spain watched with bated breath. Would she become the strong monarch her father envisioned, or the fragile pawn her enemies whispered about? Unfortunately, what unfolded was a reign where passion, politics, and scandal became inseparable. From the very start of her marriage to Francisco de Assis de Bourbon, the cracks were visible. Their union, orchestrated by the great powers of Europe, was meant to secure stability. Instead, it bred ridicule. Francisco was mocked by the Spanish people for his effeminate mannerisms, earning cruel nicknames in Madrid cafes and newspapers. Isabella herself was said to mock her husband in private, often choosing the company of lovers over the king consort, and lovers she had many. The palace corridors became infamous for whispered rumors of Isabella's affairs with generals, politicians, and even members of her household staff. She was bold in her choices, unafraid of scandal, and her appetite for companionship was legendary across Europe. Foreign ambassadors reported on her escapades with relish, and satirical prints portrayed her not as the guardian of Spain's throne, but as a queen lost in desire. Yet these affairs were more than personal indulgences, they were political. Many of her lovers were men of influence. General Francisco Serrano, for instance, became both her confidant and her intimate partner. By aligning herself with powerful men, Isabella sought stability in her private chaos, though it often had the opposite effect. Each relationship brought whispers of corruption, favoritism, and betrayal. Meanwhile, Spain itself was crumbling. Corruption plagued the court, ministries rose and fell with dizzying speed, and the country lurched between liberal and conservative governments. Isabella, instead of being a unifying figure, became a lightning rod for discontent. Every scandal in her bedroom became fuel for rebellion in the streets. The breaking point came in the late 1860. After years of misrule, economic crisis, and military unrest, the patience of the Spanish people snapped. Generals who once swore loyalty to her now plotted against her. Intellectuals condemned her in pamphlets. Ordinary citizens, weary of instability, began to chant for her downfall. In September 1868, the storm finally broke. The glorious revolution erupted. Led by General Serrano, the same man who once shared her bed, and Admiral Topete, the uprising swept across Spain with shocking speed. Isabella fled Madrid as revolutionaries marched in, her reign collapsing not with dignity but with scandal and betrayal. She crossed into France, seeking refuge in exile. The once radiant young queen was now a disgraced monarch, remembered less for her crown than for her affairs, her recklessness, and her failure to steer Spain through its darkest storms. But exile was not the end of Isabella's story. It was the beginning of a long, painful reckoning with her past, a life where scandal had stolen her throne and where bitterness would shadow her every step. What became of Isabella in exile, and how did Spain react to the fall of its scandalous queen? When Isabella II crossed into France in 1868, she left behind not just her throne but an entire nation exhausted by scandal and political chaos. The glorious revolution had swept her away, and for the first time in over 3 decades, Spain stood without its scandalous queen. The reaction across Spanish society was a mixture of relief, ridicule, and uncertainty. To conservatives, her fall symbolized the collapse of monarchy's dignity. To liberals and Republicans, it was a victory against corruption and incompetence. In Madrid, the streets erupted with celebration, bonfires lit up the night sky, and songs mocking Isabella were sung openly in taverns. The very people who once bowed to her image now laughed at her disgrace. But Spain's problems did not vanish with her departure. The country was left politically fractured, struggling to find stability. The revolutionary leaders proclaimed the beginning of a new era, but the vacuum of power was immense. Should Spain remain a monarchy under a new ruler, or should it embrace republicanism? The debate split the nation further. Even in her absence, Isabella's reign haunted Spain like a lingering ghost. Meanwhile, in Paris, Isabella settled into exile. Her new life was a far cry from the pomp of Madrid, though she lived comfortably with French support. She carried the bitter taste of betrayal. To be dethroned was one humiliation, but to be dethroned by her own former lover, General Serrano, was a wound that never healed. She spoke of him with contempt in her later years, calling him a traitor to both crown and bed. Her family life in exile was equally turbulent. Her marriage to Francisco de Assis, already loveless, grew colder still. Their children became pawns in political schemes. Their legitimacy questioned due to Isabella's notorious affairs. Even her son, Alfonso Roman XII, was shadowed by rumors about his true parentage. Yet ironically, he would one day restore the Bourbon monarchy that his mother had so spectacularly lost. For the Spanish people, Isabella became a symbol of everything wrong with monarchy. Caricatures depicted her as overweight, indulgent, and foolish. Stories of her lovers became exaggerated to the point of legend, fueling her reputation as Europe's scandal queen. And yet, in exile, she stubbornly clung to the title of Queen of Spain, refusing to abdicate until 1870, when she reluctantly gave way to her son's future claim. The fall of Isabella Roman II revealed the fragility of power. For all her scandals and indulgences, she was not the sole architect of Spain's misery. The country itself was deeply divided, torn between old traditions and modern reforms. But in the public eye, Isabella became the perfect scapegoat, a queen whose private passions were blamed for national decline. Her exile would stretch into decades, long enough to watch Spain experiment with new monarchs, republics, and political upheavals. Yet she remained on the sidelines. A fallen queen whose name had become synonymous with betrayal, desire, and exile. But from this wreckage, what lessons and legacies did Isabella leave behind? And how does Spain remember her today, through shame, nostalgia, or reluctant respect? Every fallen monarch leaves behind a trail of lessons, some of power misused, others of opportunities lost. In the case of Isabella Roman II, her legacy is painted in shades of scandal and sorrow, but also with traces of resilience and cultural impact. The first and most obvious lesson is the danger of mixing private excess with public responsibility. Isabella's affairs, though common among monarchs of her era, were not discreet. They spilled into the open, turning the palace into a theater of ridicule. In an age when the press was becoming bolder and the public hungrier for gossip, her reputation suffered irreparably. A queen could survive war and political failure, but not the perception of moral collapse. The second lesson is how fragile power becomes when it rests on unstable foundations. Isabella never truly built her own authority. From childhood, generals, politicians, and foreign powers dictated her path. When she tried to assert herself, she relied on favoritism and intimate bonds rather than sound governance. This dependency on personal relationships proved fatal when betrayal came, as it inevitably did. Yet Isabella's reign was not without enduring impact. Despite the scandals, she presided over a time when Spain slowly embraced modernization. The railways expanded, industry grew, and the seeds of a more liberal society were planted, even if chaotically. Ironically, her turbulent rule forced Spain to confront questions of identity and governance that shaped its future. Perhaps the greatest irony of her legacy is her son, Alfonso Roman XII. In 1874, 6 years after her exile, Spain restored the Bourbon monarchy under him. He was everything his mother was not: disciplined, respectable, and popular. Where Isabella embodied scandal, Alfonso became a symbol of renewal. And yet, without Isabella's downfall, his rise would never have been possible. In this way, her failure became the foundation of his success. Today, Isabella II occupies an uneasy place in Spanish memory. Historians often describe her as frivolous, indulgent, and incapable of ruling effectively. Popular imagination remembers her more for her lovers than her policies. But there is also a tragic dimension to her story. A young woman thrust into a throne she never asked for, trapped in a role she could not master, judged by standards she never met. Walking the old streets of Madrid, one can still find traces of her era, buildings constructed during her reign, cultural institutions she supported, echoes of the 19th century that bear her signature. Her legacy, like her life, is contradictory, shameful yet unforgettable, destructive yet oddly formative. Her story is not just that of a queen, but a warning about power, passion, and the consequences of losing control over both. But as her life drew to its final years, did Isabella find peace, or did she carry her bitterness until the very end? Exile became the longest chapter of Isabella II life. She was only 38 when she lost her throne in 1868, but she would live nearly 4 more decades away from Spain, long enough to watch her country stumble through republics, foreign monarchs, and finally the restoration of her own dynasty. In Paris, she settled into a life of bittersweet routine, wealthy enough to live comfortably, but stripped of power. Isabella filled her days with social gatherings, family intrigues, and the echo of what once had been. She remained proud, still calling herself Queen of Spain long after she abdicated in favor of her son, Alfonso XII, in 1870. When Alfonso ascended the throne in 1874, Isabella saw in him not just her heir, but the redemption of her disgraced legacy. And yet, personal peace always seemed beyond her reach. Her marriage to Francisco de Assis, strained from the start, was little more than a formal arrangement in exile. Rumors about her children's paternity continued to haunt her family, casting shadows even over Alfonso's rule. Isabella often quarreled with relatives, her fiery temper and stubborn pride never fully softened by time. In her later years, her once youthful beauty faded, and satirical caricatures exaggerated her into a grotesque figure of indulgence. Yet those who met her in person described a woman of wit and charm, who could still captivate a room with her sharp eyes and commanding presence. She was in every sense a queen without a throne, outspoken, contradictory, unforgettable. Isabella II died in 1904 at the age of 73 in Paris. She was eventually buried in the royal crypt of El Escorial. Returning in death to the kingdom that had once rejected her, her funeral was solemn but not grand. Spain by then had lived through too many upheavals to weep long for the scandalous queen of its past, and yet her shadow lingers. Was Isabella II merely a victim of circumstance, a young girl forced into power she could not control, or was she the architect of her own downfall, undone by passion and poor judgment? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Her story reminds us that monarchs are not gods, but flawed humans, bound by the same desires and weaknesses as those they rule. In Isabella's case, those flaws became magnified under the crown, transforming her into a symbol of both ridicule and fascination. Even now, more than a century after her death, historians still debate her reign. Was she a tragic figure crushed by politics beyond her grasp, or the scandal queen who brought a monarchy to its knees? But perhaps the deeper question is this: if Isabella had been born in a different era, one where queens could rule with freedom rather than constraint, would history have remembered her not as a scandal, but as a sovereign? Backhand index pointing right, and that is the enduring mystery of Isabella II. But tell me, do you believe scandal defined her, or was it merely the mask history chose to remember?